Good afternoon. I'm Robert Scoble. I work at Rackspace. I go around the world and study innovators and startups for Rackspace. Yesterday I was giving a talk to all the surveillance people, 4,500 surveillance people, which are pretty weird people, to tell you the truth. But one of the sessions right before mine, one of the agencies was bragging that they were checking in code to GitHub. And that was a big revolution in their conference. So there's something to this open thing that we're going to discuss today. To kick off the panel, I'd like everybody to introduce themselves who's on the panel, because it'll be better that way. So start out with Mandy.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm Mandy Waltz. If you're in the plenary this morning, you've heard enough from my mouth today. I'm the technical practice manager at Chef.
Hi, I'm Jez Humble. I work for ThoughtWorks. I'm principal and I write books as well.
Hi, I'm Ariel Teichman. I'm a venture partner with Scale Venture Partners. We're one of the investors in Chef, as well as some other companies like Box and RingCentral. And before that, I ran the operations team at Netflix. So you might have heard about some of the open source tools that we released.
I'm John Carey. I work in operations at Etsy and do lots of Chef stuff.
I'm Phil Dibowitz. I'm a production engineer at Facebook and the tech lead for the Chef team.
Very cool. So I guess I'll start out with a question that's anti-open. Why are things like the iPhone and things like Amazon AWS still closed? Why do we choose as humans some of the best breed tools that are closed? And what does that mean for the open world? Anybody who has an impulse to start?
Sure. So I'll throw in some thoughts into there. Very often I think what we end up choosing is what the best of breed is. And so, some of the examples you pointed out are just ones where the best of breed didn't have any open technologies out there. So when the iPhone came out, it just totally revolutionized mobile and just created a user experience that didn't exist before. And if there was an open standard, maybe we would have chosen that, but it wasn't. The same with Amazon. When Amazon came out, when they started with their cloud service in 2008 with EC2, they blew everyone else away because of the ease of use, how development they were. And only now are you starting to see platforms emerge from the open source community that are starting to rival that. But today they are the practice standard, which maybe we can talk about in another question, in terms of how do you bridge that proprietary and open technologies. But I think the shorter answer is that we tend to choose the things that are the best, and when open source matures to that level, then that's when it gains the broad adoption.
Yeah.
I also think that first to market makes a big difference, right? So iPhone was first, AWS was first, and in every aspect of technology, we see one of two things. Something comes out that's closed source and then open source catches up, or somebody makes something in open source and then proprietary catches up, right? And I think it maps pretty well, if you look at history, that the thing that comes out first wins first because it's the only thing out there, and then eventually the other things become reasonable competitors.
But let's bear in mind also, Darwin is the basis for the iPhone and iOS and OS X, so there's a lot of usage of open source technologies. Open source technologies made these things possible in both the case of AWS and the iPhone. So we heavily rely on this stuff as part of the infrastructure. So to say that it's just a closed proprietary model, well, that's not kind of true. I mean, the thing that's crazy to me is that the iPhone, which is such a closed environment, has created the biggest ecosystem for apps. And that's nuts. So there's kind of openness in terms of the ecosystem that's created. So I think it's unfair to say that it's one or the other. It's a kind of combination of things, and each have their advantages and disadvantages given a particular business context and business model.
For the purposes of this discussion, what is open? Because you sort of hinted that there's an openness to the closed world of the iPhone, right?
Yeah, but that's a hard argument to make, I think, just kind of to push back on your point a little bit. With Apple, I don't know, I have a hard time thinking of Apple in any way as an open company, because any app that wants to get on the Apple store has to go through their very opaque approval processes, and they get to choose whether Bitcoin apps are allowed or not allowed. So, I think actually it's more of a worrying trend that now it's Apple and Google that control access to where we most spend our time browsing. online as we see our time shifting away from the web onto native apps on phones.
I think
Didn't answer the question.
I think part of the open has different definitions depending on the company as well. Like companies like Apple, for example, the iPhone App Store is basically a walled garden, and Apple make revenue from those apps. And if the quality of the apps diminishes, Apple's revenue decreases. At the end of the day, every company represented in this room is either a for-profit company or a non-profit that still makes money, but the money goes to somebody else. So, like for example, Etsy's revenue model comes from the online marketplace we run. We open source a lot of software and a lot of our processes and stuff. Because although those enable us to make money, they're not directly tied to our revenue. Like if we open source our deployment tools, that doesn't cost us anything, apart from some engineering time and so on. So I think the ability of a company to be open, like if they're opening the thing that makes them money, it's much harder to be open about that versus other things like open sourcing software and tooling and processes and so on.
The thing that's weird for me, I agree with you that it's a very bad thing that Apple and these companies are controlling the ecosystems of where the apps are, where a lot of the development is. But it's just astonishing. I mean, one of the strengths of open source is supposed to be involvement of the community. That's what makes open source products successful. So the fact that a closed company, which Apple is the most closed company probably, and one of the most commercially successful ones as well, has been able to create this community is weird and paradoxical.
Yeah, I mean, you just have to rewind the clock just a little bit to see what is now not such a successful company, but was a decade ago, which is Microsoft, and they created an incredibly successful developer ecosystem on a completely closed, proprietary set of tools and set of technologies. So.
That was going to be my next question, because I worked at Microsoft and I saw the resistance internally to opening up and using open source and allowing it to be used even internally. So 10 years ago, we would have had a quite different panel than we have today. What's the state of open today, and what are the next challenges for the open world?
What interested me today, you probably also in the keynote this morning, the Microsoft Azure demo. What really interested me about that was probably one of the most closed source companies, built on Windows and SQL Server and things like that are closed proprietary products. They're launching this cloud platform, which obviously runs Windows, but it's running Linux as a first-class system. Like the guy who works for Microsoft was demoing on Linux VMs, and it wasn't a thing. It's like that was just what he was demoing on. So I think companies that have historically that level of proprietary lockdown and closed ecosystems essentially what this comes down to is Microsoft realizing that some people just aren't going to use Windows, and if they want to have a competitive cloud product, they're going to have to support stuff that isn't Windows because not everyone uses it. So big companies embracing that kind of.
But how much of the Azure code is being checked into open source?
I do not know.
Zero.
Not true.
How much of it is? Correct the statement.
There's a lot of stuff that comes on Azure that is being open source. Like for example, their thing is like Heroku, so you push up to Git and have that stuff come up. It's actually entirely open source on Git.
Yeah.
There's a large number of Azure projects on Git.
Very cool.
I also think that there's this, I talked a bit ago about, first to market, but I think what you're starting to see in a lot of different parts of technology is when there is a reasonable competitor that is more open, whether that mean because their APIs are more open or it's more transparent what's going on underneath those proprietary APIs or they're actually all open source. As that becomes more mature, people see the benefit in that, right? So you see the shift from iPhone being the dominant platform across the world to being not the dominant platform anywhere in Europe and almost not the dominant platform in the US. And the reason I think you see that is because as a developer, knowing what's going on underneath your app is very useful, right? And so I think you're going to continue to see the shift from your average user doesn't give a shit on whether their phone is open source or not, but everybody who's writing an app, not everybody, but a lot of them actually give a shit about whether that's open and whether all of a sudden a company can come along and be like, you know what, we don't like your app anymore. All those things are really important to the people in this room, and I think that's the reason why proprietary things may win in the short run, but in the long run, the more open a platform, the more open a technology, it's always going to win, I think, in the long run, unless it's deficient in some significant way.
Keep going on the state of open. What are the best what are the tools that you really look at as an example, a leading example of open source, and which are doing it the best?
Chef.
Fucking Chef.
Think we got step down.
Like, I mean, so speaking for Etsy, I mean, Etsy is pretty much our entire platform. All of our infrastructure runs on open source tooling. So we run on Linux. We use Chef for continuous delivery. You know, the app stack's built on PHP. We use MySQL for our databases. Like, there's just so much open source that has. I mean, in a lot of cases, it's really proven technology too. It's been around for a long, long, long time, and it's trusted by enormous businesses. Like Facebook use Chef. It's like enormous company using an open source tool every day at massive scale. Like I think it's kind of getting to the stage now where there's just so much open source software that's out there that competes on an equal, if not higher level than kind of closed source proprietary stuff.
Yeah, I think it's really common, at least for the customers that I end up working with, that the substrate is very largely open source stuff. And that sort of evolution versus, say, 15 years ago, where if you wanted to be a Linux admin, they told you to learn Solaris because nobody's going to do any fucking Linux. And now we see a lot more of that in companies of every size. So there's more of a mix at that level, but a lot of the substrate stuff's moved on.
I mean, I'll just kind of echo that, which is, I think, the LAMP stack has just done wonders for the ability of, whether it's web developers or startups to get a product to market quickly. And today, you kind of almost have to make the argument of why wouldn't you do that, where that's the default and de facto choice you would make. And so that's, I think, by far the most successful one, right? Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP getting moved on to some other technology more recently. But then, you're also starting to see a lot of success from technology like Hadoop, which, at this point is pretty much mainstream. And then some of the newer technologies that, sit on top of Hadoop or augment Hadoop in certain ways, like, Presto that Facebook released, and Spark that, which is more real-time capabilities for Hadoop. And, I think that's going to be kind of the next wave of the things that are open out there that will become part of that standard development environment that everybody uses when they build web applications.
Hadoop's an interesting example as well, because that's kind of like a really ridiculously popular open source stack that came out of not quite a closed source world, but like a closed world. It was, the research paper was released, and I think it was Doug Cutting was like, cool. So he wrote it, and now everyone uses it. And that's like, now Hadoop's like right up there in terms of, cutting edge state of the art open source software that originated from a closed world.
Well, we've hinted with it. Are companies using open as a marketing ploy, and is there a way to tell the difference between a truly open source, open world and a company that is sticking their finger in the pool?
If they're promising that it will solve all your problems, then they're probably selling it.
I also think that, a couple people asked me this question so far at ChefConf, and I think that it's hard to use open as a market ploy, because if you go find Joe Schmo on the street, you're like, dude, it's open source. They're gonna be like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. And so I think it's hard to use that as a marketing ploy. I think where open comes in the success of a business is if you are actually open, you provide benefit to the people who are developing on your platform or the people who are using it to build other tools, and you make their life easier, and so more people build on top of whatever it is you built, and that fosters adoption in end users. Because at the end of the day, what an end user cares about is there's more cool apps, or there's more cool use cases, or there's more cool devices I can plug into it, or whatever it is, and not so much whether or not they can download some source code because they don't know what it is.
If we were having this panel 10 years ago, we would probably have a long discussion about licensing models and which one, our open source thing should bet on or whatnot. Is that still a conversation in the community, or is that solved at this point?
So I think, the big thing for me was the discussion between Tim O'Reilly and Richard Stallman about this whole idea of openness, which you kind of haven't talked about. Openness being about actually being an important part of a democratic society where everyone has the right, the whole copyleft thing, everyone has the right to actually see and modify it and use the code, and making it part of our kind of part of the basis of our culture that we all have access to this source code and we can change it. And I think, to some extent, that conversation has kind of been lost. I mean, and clouds, the idea of having open source be the basis of these closed systems like AWS, that's been really problematic and led to things like the creation of the V4 of the GNU license. Those, I still think that that's an important question and something which is insufficiently discussed, and something which I think, it was very clear back in the early days, the software, whether or not it imposed the duty on people who used it to contribute back to the community.
Do you dare restate what Stallman's point of view is? Because I don't want to quote him. I've had dinner with him, and I still can't really explain where he's going with his argument.
I can't quote him, but I think he wanted to. I'm not sure if I want to misquote him and get it wrong. But
maybe at the bar later.
Yeah, I mean, my impression is that he was trying to create a world where it was part of our common inheritance, and that software was something which was, for everyone to contribute to, and to be, not to be locked away in these places where we couldn't see it and we couldn't change it. And I think that's true. I mean, in a society where software is pervasive and where our children are going to grow up and basically have these systems all around them that play a huge part in our lives, and we're already seeing that. If that's all locked away and we can't change it and we can't modify it, that's kind of pretty scary to me, actually.
The new closed is data, isn't it? We have long arguments about privacy, and we really don't have transparency on where all of our data is. When we like something on Facebook, it's in a database somewhere, right? And we don't know. I can't look at all your likes on Facebook. I can look at the official ones, but not the ones on your content. So it's not quite transparent. And we don't have correctability to this world yet. I'm playing with all these contextual assistants, sort of like Google Now, and I live on a golf course, and some of them tell me about golf shit. I hate golf. I don't want to ever hear a golf ad or a golf thing. I just happen to live on a golf course, and I can't correct it. And other places, if I'm wearing my Basis watch at night, it knows when I'm having sex, because it has a heart rate monitor and an accelerometer and a clock on it, right? And I don't know where that data is. I don't know when that's going to be used against me. And I can't tell it to shut off or obfuscate that data, right? And those are the three tenets of trust that I've been talking with companies about.
That was open.
We're going into a new world where our data is going to do lots of things and maybe do some things against us, right? And we don't have the ability to see it.
Yes, I mean, this goes to the question you asked earlier that I think we didn't fully answer, which is, what is the definition of open? I think the most natural interpretation of that is open source, where you release your source code for the product for others to see and hopefully to contribute to, and then kind of evolve and have community ownership there. But then there's openness, I think at least two other levels. You mentioned one of them, which is data, and whether you're giving access to the data. But then there's also the intermediate level of the APIs, right? So you saw, for example, LinkedIn at one point having all of their APIs wide open, and then at some point deciding that they wanted to monetize it themselves, and then closing down that ecosystem and really having a very stern hand over how they approve who's allowed into that environment. Twitter is the same. Right?
And Twitter just bought GNAP,
that's right,
which it was one of their two Firehose licensees, right? So now one of the licensees is gone.
Right, and we have investment in the other.
Yeah.
So I think that data is a super interesting topic, and I don't think it's as obvious, right? I think the problem with this is that it's not as clear as I downloaded some software, I need to be able to change the operating system that runs on my computer in order to really have control over what my computer's doing. Right, like most of the big data companies out there right now let you download all your data-ish as best as they can. But there's a whole lot of data it's not clear who owns it. If you're friends with, John B, and John B is the person who put his phone number into this social network, whatever it is, and you want to download all your friend's data. Is his phone number your data, or is it his data? It's unclear, right? And so where
Facebook blocked me for a day for doing exactly that, right?
there's
Deleted me, by the way. All my comments, everything was gone. I was like erased from the internet. It was
one
really
of
interesting.
one of the things that I've learned working at a social networking company and at Google before that, and at lots of these companies, is that when your data is an overlay of many people's data, there's a lot of gray areas, and these companies, generally speaking, I know it's hard to believe, but a lot of these companies are trying really hard to figure out what the right thing to do is and how to give people the access to the data that is theirs without accidentally giving the wrong person data. Because on the one hand, you may be like, dude, I should be able to download all my friends' phone numbers, they're my friends. And on the other hand, you may be like, dude, I put my phone number in, but I don't want someone downloading it, right? And like, both of those are right-ish, right? And so I think data is really a hard problem to solve. And I think the Facebooks and Googles and Twitters and LinkedIns and whatever are pushing these envelopes in new ways and making mistakes and fixing them and trying to understand this problem space better. And at the same time, you have the EU, who's trying to pass laws to make these better, and some of their laws make a lot of sense, and some of their laws are crazy town. But like, everyone's trying to do the right thing for users, and it's totally not clear what that is in some cases. But I think that more open discussion needs to happen just amongst people to understand that this is not, like, it's really easy as a user to be like, fuck you, give me my data, right? Or fuck you, don't give anyone my data. But neither of those are actionable things, and as users we need to be more conscientious about the weird corner cases and try and think about how we want companies to handle that and communicate that better, because I think most companies are just trying to do their best and need more input from people to understand what exactly the right thing is there, and yeah, so I think it's just complicated.
I think there's one nuance in that argument, which is that I think when we see companies trying to figure out the best thing for their users, then we all support them and we give them, you know, the leeway and kind of the rope to figure things out. I think the challenge is when their own kind of revenue and profitability comes into the picture. So, like, you know, for example, in the case of Facebook, you know, Facebook's very incentivized to not let a lot of data leave its platform, because that way it can monetize that data and better, right? So, you know, I, as a user, would love to be able to have, you know, all of my contacts information synced to my phone, but for the longest time I couldn't do that because Facebook, you know, didn't support that. And I can see why Facebook is doing it, because, you know, this way you're forced to go to the platform. And it's something I'm not picking on Facebook, obviously, you know, LinkedIn and Twitter are similar. But the challenge, you know, from the community and, you know, from the argument of openness is that we don't trust companies to do the right thing for their users. We trust them to optimize their own future revenue streams. And that's where that whole data stewardship and data ownership argument becomes very conflicted.
Should we bring this back to the open source or stay on data?
I just wanted to make one point about data, which is that we're moving from a world in which everything was forgotten unless you made an effort to preserve it, into a world where everything will be remembered unless you make an effort to forget it. And that is an enormous shift, which has unforeseeable implications. You know, my children, everything they've ever done in their lives is going to be photographed and videoed and recorded. And that, I mean, that's terrifying, right? Because, I mean, you mentioned this word control, and that's really important. Who controls that data? You know, all my stuff is in Flickr. That's not controlled by me, that's controlled by Flickr. Who controls Flickr? There's this thing, you know, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. So, like, this is this is a problem, and it's an issue, and you know, the whole Edward Snowden thing, we can't really let that go by. You know, the FBI, the government, you know, there's you know, stuff that you know, I certainly haven't been able to fully process, and I don't think any of us really.
By the way, several people in the surveillance community came up after my talk and said, now I'm freaked out. And I said, I'm freaked out by you. So
yeah,
now we're even.
Yeah, and if we're realistic, I mean, we should all be freaked out. I think anyone who's not freaked out hasn't really thought about it deeply enough.
Yeah. Going back to, or do you have?
I was going to say, to tie it back to the open source thing slightly, what I was saying before about sort of closed companies who, you know, they open source a bunch of other stuff, but not the thing that makes them money. And in the case of in the case of particularly free-to-use companies where your data is the thing that they monetize, it's like it's actively in their interest not to open that data. Much the same as, for example, Apple aren't making the iPhone App Store totally open platform. It's a closed garden because in a lot of cases the thing that makes the companies, like Jez was saying, the things that makes the companies you aren't paying to use money is your data.
Yeah. By the way, I'd love to get you guys involved. I set a little bit of tone here, but there's lots of you who probably have questions for this new world we're heading into. Out front, we were talking about the committees that run these open source projects, right? What's the good and bad in that world, and where do you hope this community takes the governance of these open source projects in the future?
I think one of the things with committees is when open source projects reach a certain size, there's a huge amount of management overhead. Like if you look at, say, the Linux kernel or Apache or massive open source projects like that, it's infeasible just to have a kind of free-for-all where you've got one maintainer who's worrying about all the pull requests and so on. But then on the other hand, you have to strike the right balance between, you don't want to stagnate innovation because it takes so much, you have 5 levels of committee approval to get through before your pull request is even considered. So I think some open source projects go far too far in regulating and having approvals and processes and 5 different steps to go through before your patch is considered. But then there does need to be some governance there, I think, but it needs to be managed so that it doesn't actively hinder you innovating and contributing to that product.
Yeah, I mean, it needs to reach a certain level of maturity before it even makes sense for it to go to committee. But then once it goes to committee, we talked about this outside a little bit too, is, it helps to have this benevolent dictator or somebody who's, a really strong personality that kind of shepherds where the project goes. And when, the flip side of that is open source projects struggling to find their way when they have different agendas of the contributors and of big members on their committee. So, I'll pick on you a little bit there, which is, OpenStack is in that category, right? And Rackspace, obviously pulls it in a certain direction, and then a big part of the community pulls it in another direction with.
There's several major players. There's IBM. There's
That's
HP,
right.
There's
Right.
several major companies, and they all want to do their own thing with OpenStack.
Exactly. And some people say that you want to have AWS compatibility. Others think that that's a bad idea. And so, OpenStack, I think, has tremendous potential, but it's struggling to really find its way because it is getting pulled in so many different directions.
Yeah.
It's really hard to mitigate all of that stuff, and we have a number of different groups of stakeholders as a company that produces a product that's ultimately open source. And if you were in Adam's roadmap talk earlier today, we're trying to balance the things that the community is enthused enough about to do for themselves and then give back to us, which is amazing, but also the things that our other groups of stakeholders are really interested in and want us to do for them. So the balance of that, trying to figure out, how to make everybody enthusiastic about it, whether they're giving us money or not, quite frankly, is an interesting one to sort of walk.
A good kind of unintentionally funny example of this, I don't know if anyone caught the Apache Foundation's April Fool's joke this year, where there was a whole fake Jira ticket where they were basically saying they were going to move the source code for SVN into their Git repositories. And there was just you'll find the ticket if you Google for it. But it was basically somebody logged a ticket for the infrastructure team to move the source code into Git. Now, the Apache Foundation has a lot of structure and infrastructure and committees and things, and literally the entire ticket was just different. I mean, it was all staged, but it was all 5 or 6 different levels of committees from different projects all weighing into this thing. It was supposed to be a joke, but I was reading the ticket and thinking this is what it's actually like when you want to do something there. And that's terrifying.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes, so let's take some questions from the audience. I see one way back there, and then I'll come and take it. Yeah.
I work for a large insurance company that's very set in their ways as far as things that we create are proprietary to us. What's a good argument or a good way to kind of sway them to go about open source and release some of that code?
It really has to be, if that is the thing that makes you money, you may never persuade the company to do it. In a lot of cases, you have to, it's maybe slightly easy for me to say because I work for Etsy who embrace open source a lot. you have to, in a lot of cases, if it's a company that's set in their ways, you have to basically sell open sourcing it to them. You have to convince them of the value. It might not be tangible financial value. It might be the community are going to think we're awesome, and they'll probably be more likely to buy insurance from us. If you can put a dollar value on open sourcing things, or kind of tie it to the way the company thinks about themselves and the way they make money, it's easier to make a case rather than just saying we should open source this because it's like the cool thing to do. Like companies don't care what, or at least in a lot of cases, management don't care what's cool. They care about making money.
We just went through the Heartbleed bug. Is there a security benefit to open sourcing that you can state definitively?
I think so. Hold on. I want to.
Because I'm trying to give him some more things other than just.
So I want to comment on what he said, and then I will comment on that as well. I think that when you're selling open sourcing something, there's a bunch of different angles you can take. Certainly, us open sourcing and being open about what we're doing with Chef has been a huge recruiting benefit for us. So that's a really big thing that you can use. Everyone here, well, not everyone, but a lot of people here are probably hiring and having a hard time finding good people. And open sourcing stuff attracts good people. So that's one big benefit. And another benefit is, if it's something that's not core to your business model and you don't have to maintain it anymore, like, yay, free money. So those would be the two things that I would recommend. As to Heartbleed, and I've said this to a million people and I'll say it to a million more, if OpenSSL wasn't open source, none of us would know about that bug. It would still be being exploited by whoever was exploiting it last week, and we wouldn't know for another 10 years. Like, yay, open source, that some researcher could look at the code and learn that.
The other thing I'll throw on to those two reasons is, we went through this rationalization quite a bit at Netflix when we decided to open source a lot of our platform and infrastructure. And recruiting was huge because it builds up your technical brand. The other benefit that you might not necessarily associate with open sourcing is you actually have an increasing quality of code quality, where we always had the saying where it's good enough for production, but is it good enough for GitHub? When developers check things in and release it, then there's a much, it's basically their resume that they're putting out in the world, and so they put a much higher level of diligence in making sure that quality is there and the architecture is solid.
One last question, because I think we have 1 minute to go. Is there any other questions? I can't see hands. So. Yes.
So back to the question about auditability and security. So working for basically one of the largest financial companies you can think of within Visa, and trying to walk that line, we have a rule that if we can't, we can't go to someone and say it's your fault that this broke, and we can't bring it in-house. And so we always have to buy something with a vendor that's backing it, i.e. Chef or something like that. Now, I made an image, and Kobe just tweeted it. I made it a while ago because I wanted to have an honest debate about if you look at something and say which is easier to audit, open source or not, and I'm continually having this argument, I put it on LinkedIn, I continually try to post it just to see what people think. Which one seriously is easier to audit? Because Microsoft didn't have a Heartbleed, and Linux did. So you got to ask yourself, and I'm
Because
personally...
Microsoft's never had security exploits?
No. All I'm saying is that I'm a fan of open source, and I'm trying to get them to adopt it, so I'm trying to figure out how to bridge that gap and prove to them that having 10 million people look at code as opposed to a small group of insular people is a good thing.
So a good example to kind of talk about that point and also tie it back to Heartbleed is there's a fairly well-known large CDN who wrote a blog post when the whole Heartbleed thing was going on, basically saying it's totally cool, we're not vulnerable, we basically have a custom stuff in our OpenSSL libraries which basically makes us invulnerable to Heartbleed. And then they were like, oh, we've totally contributed it back because we're awesome and now it's out there. And within about a day, somebody had found a massive security hole in there, which meant they were totally vulnerable. And then they basically had to write another blog post saying, okay, we're rotating everyone's SSL certificates now. And they have a lot of smart people there. But just because you hire a lot of smart people doesn't necessarily mean you know everything. And it took, in this case, open sourcing it, and some security researcher went over the code and spotted this gaping hole that they just missed. And just basically, the more eyes you have on it, the more likely you are to catch that stuff.
And there's a point to be made there too, in like other innovation communities in like biotechnology and other places where you don't walk in the door with the assumption that your company has hired the smartest people on the planet. That somebody out there somewhere in the 7 billion human beings on this planet may know your problem domain better than you do, or have some interesting outlook on it that's going to help you in the long run. And the more open and transparent you can be about things, then the more you reap the benefits of those people too.
And with that, thank you very much for joining us for this panel. It was really interesting.